Welcome to Finding Jesus Today. I'm Jamison Stewart, and with me is my good friend Drew Suttles. Today we're going to be discussing Jesus' birth announced to Mary, a virgin of humble background, from Luke chapter 1, verse 26 through verse 56. I encourage you to take a moment if you can and read the text before we enter our study together. As always, we ask you to hold us accountable to the text as we study the Word of God together. You know, Drew, as we think about Jesus' birth announced to Mary, a virgin who is from a humble background, a lowly background, so to speak, we think about her, and we think about this being the gospel to the outcast. You know, you think about Mary, how is she from a humble background? Does the text give us any ideas as to kind of what that meant or what's going on there?
Yeah, in fact, verse 48 says that she is from a lowly state. Said that God had remembered the lowly state of his maidservant. But something else to consider is that Mary was going to be married to Joseph. Joseph was a carpenter. So she's not going to be marrying the upperclassmen or this elite person in society. She's just a humble person. But she's just a person that God was looking for. And so she fits that criteria perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we think about something to help us as we think about the context of what's going on here, and we think about working class people back then. Perhaps it's a little bit different than it is today. Back then, you know, someone who was working class, they had to work, and they earned basically every day a day's pay, and that was what they needed to live on for that day.
Yeah.
They didn't really have a lot of prospects of, you know, saving up a lot and becoming rich and, you know, being able to climb that ladder. It was, you know, they were from this working class, everyday person background, having enough to live on that day, and that's kind of where they were going to stay.
Yeah,
they weren't.
That's right.
They weren't living in a palace, and she wasn't going to be living in a palace.
Right.
In fact, later on in Luke, we get to Luke chapter 2, and it talks about the sacrifice they make when they bring Jesus to the temple. And the sacrifice they make shows that they were poor people. So
that's right.
We think about Jesus' birth being announced to Mary. It's significant because, you know, it wasn't announced to, you know, someone high and mighty in society, but just an ordinary person, Mary, a virgin of a humble background, a poor class,
that's
working
right.
people. When we think about, too, from this section in Luke chapter 1, verse 26 through 56, and we think about the significance, about the difference between what the world thinks of the social outcast and what God thinks of them, you know, what stands out in your mind, the difference there between what the world thinks and what God thinks?
Yeah, the world looks at social outcasts and say, well, they're not important. They're not really valuable. They can easily be overlooked, but God does not overlook anyone. In fact, we know that every human being is made in the image of God, according to Genesis 1, 26 and 27. And so everyone is important in the eyes of God, regardless of your standing in society. You are important to God.
Yeah, absolutely. And that passage you just mentioned, Genesis 1, 26 and 27, I'm actually going to read it quickly just so people can have that in their minds. The text says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." So we think about a single person. We think about an individual. Our society has forgotten just how valuable every single person is, because every single person is made in God's image. You know,
exactly.
And later on in the book of Luke, And then maybe you have another thought to add to this. God mentions in Luke 9:25, Jesus talking, he tells us that our soul is worth more than all the world. So
That's right.
we think about the value that we have, and it's something we need to keep that in mind, just how
right.
important we are to God. Is there something else that you were thinking along those lines you'd like to add?
Yeah, you mentioned Luke 9. About Luke 15. You think about the value of one soul, and in that chapter, you think about those parables. The value continues to grow, right? You have the lost sheep, you have the lost coin, then you have the lost son. Well, of all three of those, the son is the most valuable because he has a soul. So you see Jesus using these parables, saying, "Look how important one soul is." For example, Luke 15 and verse 7, as well as verse 10. Rejoicing in the presence of, in heaven when one sinner comes back, leaving the 99 for the one. And so over and over and over again, we're reminded of the purpose of the book of Luke, Luke 19:10. Jesus came to seek and to save that which was lost. Every single person, every soul is important to God.
Yeah. And we think about the way this world, many in society, they don't look at people the way that God does. God sees every person is valuable. This world, sadly though, because many have forgotten that, they look for ways to abuse and take advantage of the social outcast, the poor, maybe the disabled. Many people oftentimes are looking for ways to take advantage of those people. God seeks not to abuse them, not to take advantage of them, but to help them. A passage that stands out to me in thinking about that is James 1, verse 27, where James writes that pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this. And one of the things then he says is to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. We think about what God sees as pure religion, and one of the parts of that is visiting or seeing to the needs of the fatherless and the widows, the outcast.
That's right.
And so as you think about, as we think about ways today that the world abuses and takes advantage of the social outcast, and you think about what God seeks to do, is there anything that comes to your mind in particular that stands out in how God seeks to help those who are outcast and not take advantage of them?
Oh yeah, no doubt. You mentioned James 1:27, and like Brother Mosier always told us, that's a New Testament update to what we've already read in the Old Testament. I jotted a few of these down. Deuteronomy 10:18 says that God administers justice for the fatherless and widows, and he loves the stranger. Psalm 146 in verse 9, he watches over the strangers and relieves the fatherless and widows. And then Jeremiah 49:11, God is essentially saying, leave them to me. And so as Christians, our responsibility, if we're going to be true children of God, we're going to see to the needs of those who are in need, because God says, you give them to me. Society may throw them out to the side and say, you're not worth anything, but God says, you are important to me. I'm going to see to it that you're taken care of if you'll submit to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that comes to mind, and it seems like on the news, maybe every few months, there's some new, scam that's out there where people are trying to take advantage of other folks. And it seems like they're always targeting maybe older people. They're targeting those who perhaps don't understand maybe some of the technology side of things as well. They're trying to take advantage of people. In our society, all too often, it's like that. And God's not like that.
Sure.
And, as we think about then this section that we're talking about, why does this matter to us in our search to find Jesus today? What's something here that stands out to you? This is why this should matter to us today.
I think it should matter to us because we are valuable to God. Again, we've talked about in this entire episode and going through this text, whether it's Mary, whether it's everybody you read about in here, regardless of how society viewed them, they were important to God. And today, you might feel like, well, I'm not important. Nobody really notices me. Well, God does. God not only notices you, he cares for you. And he cares for you so much that he sent his only begotten son to die for you. How much more could someone care for you than to do that? So I believe this section is important because we know that we're valuable to God.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking about the value, how valuable we are to him, there's some teaching out there that actually, when we think about it, it denies this. There's something that goes around in the world today that's sometimes called the prosperity gospel. And basically, when we think about what that teaches and then look at what God teaches here, the prosperity gospel denies that we're all valuable to God. Because really what's being taught there is the more you have, the richer you are. Obviously, then the more favorable that God has looked upon you and the more he is blessing you and the greater his love is for you. It exalts the rich and the powerful, and it really pushes down and kind of brushes away the poor. God doesn't do that in his word.
No.
So in thinking about that, you were talking about how valuable we are to God. Over in Psalm, I believe, chapter 8, David's writing that psalm, and he's looking up at the heavens and looking up at the stars and wondering about all that. And he asks the question, what is man that God is mindful of him? We think about how small we really are in comparison to everything around us, and yet God still cares for us. Was there another lesson that stood out to you, or something else that stood out in the last couple minutes we have today? Yeah,
based on that prosperity gospel idea, if you don't have all these things, well, God's not blessing you. He doesn't really care for you. That's evident because you don't have anything. Well, fast forward to Luke 16, 19 to 31, and think about the rich man and Lazarus. If someone were to ask you, which one would you rather be? The rich man who fared sumptuously, he had everything he needed, or would you rather be the one that sits outside begging for crumbs? Well, everybody would probably jump to say, well, I want to be like the rich man. Obviously, he's being blessed. But when they die, we see their roles being reversed. We see Abraham carried by the angel, or rather Lazarus carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Then it just says the rich man died. Everything that he thought he had, it was gone. So today we have to keep that in mind. To be poor in this world, but to be rich in God is all that really matters. It's not wrong to be rich. It's not wrong to have things, but that's not an indication of how much God loves you or how he's going to bless you.
Yeah. All too often, perhaps the things that we count in this world as valuable, we get to the end of this life and we think about all those things that maybe we thought were so important and were so valuable, and we realize, well, it probably wasn't as valuable as we thought it was. It didn't matter nearly as much as we thought it did. In the last 30 seconds we have in thinking about, how valuable we are to God, is there something that stands out to you, perhaps, that we need to mention in the final few moments we have?
I would say strive for humility. If you want to be great, if you want to be exalted, be humble. And the Bible in both the Old and New Testament speaks of exalting those who are humble. So regardless of your status in society, be a humble servant of God and you'll be exalted.
That's right. Being humble and remembering the value that we have and how valuable we are to God will help us in our search to find Jesus today.